So, way back in 732, a single battle was fought that people have been arguing about for centuries. This is the story of the Battle of Tours, a showdown that many historians have claimed literally decided the fate of Europe. But the real question is, did one guy with one army on one random field really save all of Western civilization? Let's find out.
And this quote right here, this is the classic high-stakes view, famously written by the historian Edward Gibbon. He's painting this picture of a world on a total knife's edge. He's saying that if Tours had gone the other way, Europe as we know it would be completely different. And for hundreds of years, that was the story, a heroic Christian victory that stopped the unstoppable. But, and this is a big but, is that epic story actually true? Historians today are looking at this narrative a lot more critically. Was this really a world-altering clash of civilizations, or was it more like a really big raid that just got blown up into a legend over time? Well, the answer is way more complicated and honestly, way more interesting than you might think. Okay, let's dive into this. To really get what happened at the battle, you first have to understand the two worlds that were on a collision course right in the heart of what we now call France. You had a global superpower on one side, and on the other, a rising, kind of rugged kingdom that would end up defining Europe's future. So in 732, the Umayyad Caliphate was, you could argue, the world's #1 military and economic power. I mean, it stretched all the way from the borders of China to Spain. Their armies were sophisticated, they were diverse, and they were built around this terrifyingly effective heavy cavalry. Now, the Frankish realm, which was run by a guy named CharlesMartel, was a totally different beast. It was still a bit fragmented, but it was coming together, and it was without a doubt the top military dog in Western Europe, built on a foundation of incredibly tough, disciplined heavy infantry. And the Umayyads, they were on a roll. I mean, after conquering most of Spain in just a few years, they poured over the Pyrenees Mountains. By 719, they controlled a chunk of southern Gaul, even setting up a capital. Yeah, they had a little setback in 721, but that barely slowed them down. By 725, their raiding parties were hitting deep into Burgundy. Then, in 732, the governor, al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, leads this massive expedition north, and honestly, it looks like nothing could possibly stop him. And caught right in the middle of all this, a guy named Duke Odo of Aquitaine. He was a big deal in his region, but he was pinned between two expanding powers, CharlesMartel's flanks to the north and the Umayyads to the south. After winning an earlier battle, his luck just completely ran out. In 732, Abd al-Rahman's army met Odo's forces and just crushed them. Odo managed to escape, his army was shattered, and he had to go make a desperate appeal to his biggest rival, Charles Martel. So Charles agreed to help, but there was a catch. Odo had to swear fealty to the Franks. With Aquitaine now basically under his control, the stage was set. Charles Martel gathered his army of seasoned veterans and marched south to meet Abd al-Rahman in a confrontation that would echo through history. Now, this is where Charles Martel shows he's not just a tough guy, he's a brilliant strategist. He absolutely knew that he couldn't beat the Umayyad cavalry in a straight-up fight on some big open field. His army was almost all infantry. So what does he do? He makes the terrain his best weapon. He marches his army south using smaller secondary roads to achieve total surprise. And then he picks the battlefield, a high, wooded plain. This genius move would force the Umayyad cavalry to charge uphill, through trees, which would totally kill their momentum and neutralize their single greatest strength. And check this out. This incredible description comes from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, a source written not long after the battle. For about 7 days, the two armies just kind of stared each other down, skirmishing, each waiting for the other to make the first big move. Finally, Abd al-Rahman ordered the charge. The Umayyad cavalry slammed into the Frankish line over and over and over again. But the Franks, they didn't break. This account describes them as an immovable wall, a glacier that just absorbed the shock and then struck back with devastating force. So what was the turning point? How did it all fall apart for the Umayyads? Well, while their cavalry was getting bogged down against that Frankish wall, something critical happened in their rear. Frankish scouts, or maybe even Duke Odo's surviving men, launched a surprise raid on the Umayyad camp, which was full of all the loot and plunder they'd gathered. This sparked panic. A big chunk of the Umayyad army literally broke off from the main fight to go save their treasure. In the middle of all that chaos, Abd al-Rahman gets surrounded and killed. Now they're leaderless, they're in disarray, and under the cover of night, they retreat. The next morning, the Franks woke up, ready for another day of fighting, and found an empty battlefield. The Umayyad army was gone. The immediate consequences of this victory were going to reshape the entire political map of Western Europe. Not overnight, but for years to come. So the Umayyad army pulled all the way back to Spain. But for Charles, this victory was political gold. His prestige went through the roof. It's when he earned the nickname Martellus, which means the hammer. He used that newfound clout to solidify his control over regions like Aquitaine. And here's the most important part. This victory cemented his family's right to rule, laying the political groundwork for his grandson, a little guy named Charlemagne, to build the massive Carolingian Empire. But, and this is super important to remember, Tours wasn't some kind of magic bullet that solved everything. The Umayyad threat didn't just disappear. They still held key cities in southern Gaul. Charles himself had to lead more campaigns years later, in 736 and 739, to keep pushing them back. You can think of Tours as the beginning of the end for major Umayyad expansion north of the Pyrenees, but it was far from the final battle. And this brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part, the battle over the story itself. How did this one single engagement spark more than 1,000 years of intense debate? Well, the answer is all about how the story of Tours has been told and retold through the centuries. To get into that, we need to quickly touch on a key concept, historiography. It sounds kind of academic and complicated, but it's pretty simple. It's basically the history of history. It's not just about what happened, but about how we know what happened, and why different eras can look at the exact same event in completely different ways. And believe me, the Battle of Tours is a perfect case study for this. For centuries, and especially starting in the 1700s, the main view was crystal clear. Historians like Edward Gibbon and John Henry Harren saw Tours as one of the most decisive battles in all of world history. In this story, Charles Martel is the savior of Christendom, the man who stood in the gap and single-handedly saved Europe for Christian civilization. End of story. But then, in the 20th and 21st centuries, a whole new view started to emerge. Historians like Philip Currie-Hitti began to poke holes in that traditional narrative. They argued that the Umayyad force wasn't a full-on invasion army trying to conquer Europe, but more of a massive raiding party. They suggested the caliphate was already stretched too thin, facing its own internal problems, and that this Muslim wave was basically at its high watermark anyway. And this brings us right to the heart of the debate today. Was Tours this huge, world-altering turning point that saved Europe? Or was it an important military victory that over time has been mythologized and maybe a little overstated for political and cultural reasons? So let's just break it down. You've got two main camps. The decisive battle argument focuses on the external threat. It says, look, without Martel's victory, there was no other army that could have stopped a full conquest of Europe. But the overstated raid argument focuses on internal factors. It points to things like civil wars and revolts inside the Umayyad Caliphate as the real reason the age of expansion was ending, making Tours more of a symptom than a cause. So after all that, what can we say for sure? Well, whether or not it saved Christendom is definitely up for debate. But here's what is undeniable. The battle's impact inside the Frankish world was massive. It cemented Charles Martel's power, it legitimized his family's rule, and it created the stable political foundation his grandson, Charlemagne, would use to build the first great European empire since the fall of Rome. That part is not up for debate. Ultimately, the whole story of Tours forces us to ask a much bigger question. How does a battle, any battle, become a legend? Why do we, as a culture, pick certain moments in history, lift them up, and turn them into these foundational myths for entire civilizations? You see, the debate over Tours isn't just about what happened in 732, it's about why we tell the stories that we do.